Just waiting for Nishat ma'am now.
He's
Oh,
here.
ma'am is here, she's saying.
Ma'am is here.
Okay,
Okay.
ma'am.
Shall I begin?
Yes.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our plenary session. Our chair for this session is Professor Nishat Zaidi. I'll now give a formal introduction for her. Nishat Zaidi is the professor and head, Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. Her research interests include postcolonial writings, Indian literature in English translation, comparative literature, and women's writings. A scholar, critic, and translator, she has 10 books and a number of published papers to her credit. She has co-edited Story is a Vagabond, Fiction Essays and Drama by Intizar Hussain, special issue of Manoa, University of Hawaii, 2015. Guest edited 2 special issues of the review journal, The Book Review. Her translation of Day and Dastan is her most recent publication. Thank you, Nishat ma'am, for joining us. Please begin the session.
Thank you, Aditi. I welcome you all to the 4th plenary of this amazing conference. And I'm really delighted to welcome 2 young and highly accomplished scholars to this session. The first speaker of the day is Avishek Parui. Very warm welcome to you, Avishek. Personally, I really admire your work, but let me give a formal introduction. Avishek is Assistant Professor of English at IIT Madras and Associate Fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. He researches on memory studies, which I am sure most of you are aware of and must have followed him. If not, then do it now. Medical humanities, masculinity studies, and critical theory. He is the author of postmodern literature and is currently contracted with Rowman and Littlefield for his second book, Culture and Literary Matter, Metaphor, Memory. We are looking forward to this book, Avishek. He is one of the faculty coordinators of Memory Studies Research Network at IIT Madras. So over to you, Avishek.
Thank you very much, Professor Zaidi, for a very kind introduction. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to such an august conference, really. So well conceived as well, so relevant to our times. So I'll just go in a very old-fashioned way. I'll read out from a piece of paper. I'm not using the PowerPoint. So as you know, I have titled my session as Memory, Shading, and the Storytelling Mind. Obviously looking at it from the perspective of consciousness, globalization, and also fiction. So my primary argument is to look at the instruments and the ontology of storytelling, and how that is a very important instrument in globalization, and how fiction sort of problematizes it as well as consolidates it, how we consume fiction consolidates and sometimes subverts the concept of globalization. So this talk aims to examine memory as a storytelling activity. That's the fundamental premise of the work that I try to do in memory. I look at memory as a storytelling activity. And it sort of draws on the research in cognitive neuroscience by several figures, actually, but not least of Antonio Damasio, V.S. Ramachandran, Joseph Ladue, and Eric Kandel, as well as in cognitive narratology by David Hermann and Jerome Bruner. So, some of us who are students of the subject would know that there's an increasing interest in fiction and poetry among cognitive neuroscientists, especially in the way they try to examine the human mind as something more complex than the brain, right? And of course, there's a lot of research happening on looking at the relationship between memory and storytelling through emplotment. How even memory operates through emplotment. There's a sequence to memory, there's a narrative quality about memory, etc. So it will further, this talk will also try to further define memory as a special form of storytelling, which may be shared, collective, and enactive in quality. So there's a performative, enactive quality about storytelling, as well as memory. And this, I argue, is an interesting component of the way we consume what we call globalization through our consciousness, political consciousness, cognitive self as well. The talk will highlight how, like storytelling, memory is an act of emplotment and encoding. one which also entails effacing. So this is again an argument that I make, that if memory is an act of encoding, we sort of encode information, and that's how memory happens ontologically as well as functionally. But what is also important is for us to understand that every act of encoding is also simultaneously an act of effacing. Right? So encoding and effacement happen simultaneously. And this is something which is corroborated by cognitive neuroscience. So we sort of know it now that memory and forgetting are not really ontological opposites of each other, sort of the cognitive components of each other in a certain sense. In other words, if we are to remember something, we should be able to forget. Right? So forgetting is an ability. And of course, this can become political. Forgetting can become an act of production. So we have examples of collective amnesia, how people are asked to forget something through very complex epistemic instruments like history books, films, documentaries, propaganda, whatever. But so forgetting can be produced. Right? Forgetting can be a phenomenon which can be produced through some very material processes. But I mean, suffice it to say at this point that forgetting and remembering are connected categories. So encoding and effacement happen simultaneously. Lastly, drawing on the works of Alan Palmer, I will try to examine the medium of fiction as a process of shading. So Palmer, as most of you would know, has this really interesting book called The Fictional Mind, where he talks about the idea of shading. So shading is a sort of gray entanglement of fact and fabulation. And that is where fiction comes into being. So in other words, fiction is a combination of reality and possibility. What really happened with what could have happened. So there's a very interesting, this is my argument, there's an interesting and important ontological difference between fiction and lie, or fiction and fantasy, because there's always a component of reality about fiction, right? So it sort of combines different perspectives, what really took place historically with what could have taken place, and sometimes what should have taken place. And that's the reason why maybe fiction books get banned more often than history books, because they show and dramatize the possibilities of the things that could have happened if they were allowed to happen, etc. So that's how it's quite subversive. And I make the argument that the subversive quality about fiction is exactly in this combination, this shading, that it combines reality and possibility with what did happen, with what could have happened, and what may have happened if it was allowed to happen. So that's where it begins to get complicated. And this is exactly what Palmer defines as shading, this sort of gray entanglement of different perspectives. So the talk will conclude with a note on the renewed relevance of fiction in a globalized world, which we inhabit and internalize today. And this is a bit of a personal thing, that at the end of the day, I'm a literature student, so I just carry on this banner of fiction very heavily. So my argument is, no matter what the research is, if it's memory studies or medical humanities, etc., we as students of fiction need to foreground it through fiction, right? So there's very attractive work happening in neuroscience and cognitive neurology, etc. But I think if we are to be sincere as scholars, we need to be sincere to our training as people in fiction and in literature. So this literariness of the research is something that I foreground, sometimes a bit heavy-handedly. Okay, so this talk tries to engage with the really fascinating topic of this conference, which is globalization and new terrains of consciousness from a phenomenological framework. And I'm really intrigued with the use of the word terrains, because I think there is a, maybe, I am overreading or misreading it. Maybe this is not what the organizers meant, but for me, when I heard the word terrains of consciousness, it sort of seemed to me there's a textual quality about consciousness, which was being highlighted, the textuality of consciousness. Right? So different texts coming together, and that gives a sort of terrain-like, palimpsest-like structure to consciousness. In other words, consciousness is less of a seamless flow rather than and more of a metonymic method. So things coming together and forming terrains, right? So it'll examine globalization and consciousness as cognitive and textual/narrative categories, which are collective as well as private in quality. For globalization may be interestingly studied as a process of remembering as well as dismembering, which has an inactive, extended, and textual quality. And as someone who studies memory, when I use the word remembering, I almost always use it with a hyphen, re-membrane. So again, that sort of foregrounds the textuality of remembering, re-member, And what it also implies that something has to be dismembered. Something must have been lost at some point of time for that to be remembered. Right? So there's a sense of an acknowledgement of absence, which is there. Something must have been lost, something must have been slipped off, something must have been truncated, amputated. So there is this violent, corporeal, organic quality about memory that I want to highlight. Of course, if you're using that method, this theoretical lens and mapping it onto something like partition, it'll make a lot of sense, right? The Holocaust, a partition. If you're using remembering as a sort of violent, cognitive, corporeal method, it makes a lot of sense. But for the purpose of this conference, I'm looking at globalization as a process of remembering and dismembering, which has an inactive, extended, and textual quality, right? So globalization as something which we sort of collectively remember, remember, and keep repeating. So there's a, it's obviously a consumable thing. So for something to become globalized, it must be consumed repeatedly, right? And again, I'm going to talk about the consumption bit in a moment. So just as there are certain ideas and markers which are readily remembered and recognized in the frame and phenomena of globalization, which may include moon landing as well as 9/11, there must needs be events and identities which are more often than not effaced rather than encoded. In other words, the premise of my talk is that globalization is not really universalization, right? There's a fundamental difference between globalization and universalization. In fact, my argument is globalization is a very, very metonymic process. Globalization is a very, very biased process. There are certain entities, certain events, certain figures, which are repeatedly remembered. And my choice of examples is obviously non-innocent. I use moon landing and 9/11. Both very American examples, right? So these are events which are constantly replayed, constantly remembered. There are memorials, there are cinema, there are museums. In other words, that is produced in a way to become a part of the collective imaginary, right? So we're looking at globalization as a process of production, which is a very material, metonymic process. And I'm interested in this play between materiality and metonymy in a way. So the certain fragments are repeated again and again through certain very effective as well as affective instruments of circulation, right? And I'll come to the point of effect and effect in a moment. So what this immediately means is that forgetting is not a passive process, but a political and productive one. Connected to both activities, remembering and forgetting, are they embedded as well as inactive cognitive quality, whereby reiteration and repetition inform privileged forms of representation. And this is the other thing that I just mentioned, globalization as a privileged form of representation. For something to become globalized, again, there's a politics of privilege which informs that kind of representation, which obviously enters the economy of consumption. It could be meanings, it could be memorials, it could be burgers, it could be 9/11, anything. Again, my examples are very non-innocent. So obviously, I'm attempting to delineate really the difference between globalization and universalization in terms of highlighting how the former, which is globalization, works with cognitive biases and privileged markers of remembering, which are more often than not selective and exclusive. So this is the fundamental thing I want to differentiate. That globalization is not universalization, right? So globalization is a very metonymic process which works with cognitive bias, a very, very strong cognitive bias. And of course, we all know how cognitive bias can very quickly become political bias, right? So a very interesting relationship in cognition and politics, especially collective cognition. So for if globalization may be defined as an economic, cultural, and political process of extension and expansion, it most definitely does not entail an innocent or all-inclusive framework. So if globalization is the process of extension or expansion, is definitely not all-inclusive, right? So for example, when you talk about global networks, or global food, or global anything, it's obviously something very local, which has been repeated and consumed so many times, it's become global. So it is not all-inclusive at all. There's a very selective process, and exclusion plays a very big deal in globalization. This is, again, another argument that I'm making. It's not just about what is included. It's equally about what is excluded, what is dismembered, right? And again, this brings the idea of memory as a very sort of complex category in globalization, what gets included, what gets excluded to processes of remembering. So what it does, globalization, it produces and promotes an economy of privileged materials, privileged metaphors, and metonymic markers of identity and their consumption. Therefore, this paper makes the fundamental argument that globalization is a material, metaphoric, and metonymic process created and curated through certain privileged rituals of remembrance. So again, if you look at metaphor as a condensation of different kinds of semantic structures. So a metaphor is a complex semantic structure in the sense that it means something literally as well as something else, right? So this flexibility, this slipperiness, the semantic slipperiness of metaphor is interesting, and it's a very effective instrument in globalization. The moment I say, I want to hang out and have burgers, right? That becomes a metaphor for a certain kind of lifestyle, right? Which is very quickly seen as sort of globalized urban lifestyle. Again, I'm looking at the non-innocence of metaphors over here. Well, metaphors are never innocent, as Derrida reminded us. So, and of course, we all know today through empirical, scientific, as well as philosophical frameworks, that consciousness is a material process. Right? So we need to look at consciousness also as a material process that operates like language through association, which is the realm of the metaphor, as well as fragmentation, which is the realm of the metonymy. So the way we operate as conscious subjects is through metaphors. We connect things, we attach things, and that's how we process mentally, as well as we fragment and disassemble things or decouple things, right? That is the metonymic way through which consciousness operates. And there's a simultaneous activity happening, metaphor as well as metonymy. So this is why I'm trying to bring in the current research on memory studies in terms of hopefully offering an original framework to revisit the entanglement of globalization and consciousness, especially in the forms of the textuality of it. Okay, so some very quick and sort of summary-like structure on memory studies that we know, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that neuroscientists tell us today that the process of remembering and the more experimental, the more scientific model is a model of reconstruction. So scientists actually use the word reconstruction more often than remembering. Again, that has a textual quality to it. Reconsolidation, reconstruction. And in fact, there's someone called Joseph Ledoux. He's got really some books on synapses, the synaptic self, etc. And he's got a book called Emotional Brain as well, which is again looking at emotions as a co-cognitive thing. So again, literature becomes important. Now, Ledoux has this very interesting concept of reconsolidation, which says that what we remember, every act of remembering, it doesn't go back to the original memory. It actually goes back to the last remembered version of the event, right? So again, there's a textual process. When you remember a particular event, we go back in our heads to the last remembered version, and from there we remember it again. So every act of remembering is also slipping away from the original idea, the original point. So this idea of pure memory disappears. So we know through empirical research in cognitive and clinical neuroscience today that total recall is a myth, right? Except in an Arnold Schwarzenegger film. So it is a myth. It doesn't happen, total recall, except maybe in very futuristic representations or exceptional case studies. In fact, there's a very interesting short story by Borges. So some of you may have read it. It's called Funes de Memorias. It's about a boy called Funes who falls from a horse, gets hit on the head, and his diseases he cannot forget. He literally remembers everything, like every detail gets in his head. And interestingly, what it does, and that's almost seen as a case study medically as well, that his ability for abstractions, his ability for imagination, his ability for empathy begins to go away, right? And in an interesting sense, what it tells us is forgetting is an essential device for abstraction. You need to be able to forget in order to have this imaginative quality which informs normal memory. So imagination, empathy, abstraction, these sort of rely on the ability to forget to a certain extent, right? And of course, if that disappears through an accident or curious case study, then we see some very complex situations. Okay, and of course, Antonio Damasio's work is very useful for us today. And he's one neuroscientist who goes and looks at someone like Spinoza and writes on Spinoza deconstructs Dekra, and looks at the whole embodied idea of cognition, cognition as an embodied activity, and also as an emotional activity. And he is one of the premier neuroscientists today who works on emotion and cognition. So, his thesis actually is that if our ability to emote goes away or disappears, that also compromises us cognitively at a very basic level. And there's so many literary examples we can think of, even the sort of high modernist examples, such as Mrs. Dalloway, when you have a sort of PTSD veteran coming back, and we keep hearing that he cannot feel, he cannot feel, he cannot feel. His ability for feelings go away at a very fundamental level. And that begins to affect him cognitively. He cannot recognize, he cannot understand who's around them because he cannot emote. Obviously it's more complex in that novel. Now, and then we have someone like V.S. Ramachandran, who's famous for his works on phantom limbs. And even that work can be drawn on, interestingly, to look at the relationship, the play between absence and partial presence, right? Because, if you read Ramachandran's works, obviously very hardcore medical works on the phantom limb, where he talks about how a limb which is not there anymore, physically speaking, there seems to be some kind of a spectral presence, which is still there. So people have itch on their phantom limbs, which is not there anymore. So hence the whole idea of phantom. And again, it's a very interesting choice of metaphor, phantom, play between, presence and partial absence. And we can connect it to the idea of spectrality, which is a big deal in literature, as we all know. So in other words, what these cognitive and clinical neuroscientific studies on memory and embodiment reveal may also be interestingly and uniquely mapped to more macro models of memory as a cultural activity. And we can have someone like Yuri Lotman, who's a really interesting figure in this. The play between presence and absence, the play between what is remembered and forgotten. So memory, so in other words, what I'm trying to do is looking at memory as an intersection between sort of embedded biological activity and a more extended cultural activity. And we're looking at some structural similarities. Because every culture, every nation, every national narrative would have events and situations which are constantly repeated. And equally, every culture, every nation would have events and actions and situations which are deliberately forgotten. So forgetting plays a big deal in cultural memory as well, just like we have forgetting as an important component in our brain memory, the clinical embedded memory system. Now, what this obviously means is that emotions become a very important category, affect becomes a very important category. So the affective instruments of culture, particularly with respect to globalization, are of course covertly and sometimes overtly discursive and political inequality. So affect is a big deal in globalization, right? Of the way in which a burger appears. I don't know why I'm using burger so many times, but it's a handy metaphor. But the way it has appeared is not just important that you make it effective. It must be effective in quality. It must make us attracted to it. And you can think of any number of examples of effect through which a certain kind of instrument becomes globalized. We can talk about a certain kind of masculinity, a certain form of femininity, a certain kind of style statement. For it to become globalized in quality, there must be a lot of effective investment in it, right? And of course, investment is very economical, very economic, very material, very metonymic, but at the end of the day, very effective in quality as well. Now, this effective entanglement, it ranges from the major machines of effect production, such as Hollywood, for example, to more micro markers of consumption, such as, let's say, food items, cappuccino, coffee, food, certain kinds of food. So in micro metaphors, as well as in macro machines, effect plays a very important role. And advertisement, obviously, is a very interesting spectacle for this, a very important platform for this. So globalization then, especially through a phenomenal frame, may thus also be described as an effective economy of shared signifiers, which are strategically produced and consumed. So this is my working definition of globalization, an effective economy of shared signifiers, which are strategically produced and consumed over and over again, for something to become globalized in quality. Now, and now I'll come to the second bit of my presentation, which is also the sort of beginning to wind up bit. There's a very important term, and it's a bit of a discovery that I sort of stumbled upon, same metaphor is used by two very different people talking about sort of similar terms. So Joseph Ledoux, who's a very famous neuroscientist working on synapses and synaptic cells and emotional brain. Ledoux has this very important concept of chunking, right? Chunks, C-H-U-N-K. And the argument that Ledoux makes is that memory and the activity of remembering operate only through chunks. And what chunks mean is that it's a selected fragment of information and integration. So there's a sort of a chunking process through which information is encoded, right? Which obviously immediately means certain things which are left out of the chunk, right? So memory operates through a chunking process, through chunks. In other words, memory is quite clearly a metonymic activity, highlighting how remembering is a process of inclusion as well as exclusion, and that leaving out details or forgetting is a cognitive component of remembering rather than its ontological opposite. Now, interestingly enough, and in support of the central argument of this paper, the same term chunking is used by the cognitive narratologist David Hermann. Now, I'm not sure if Hermann and Ledoux know each other. I hope they don't, which makes my paper more original. So anyway, so Hermann has this idea of chunking as well. And his argument is the stories are formed through chunking, right? So every act of narration is an act of chunking. And this is why he brings in this concept of cognitive narratology, this relationship between cognition and narration. And Hermann, of course, is a phenomenal figure in this field's book, Storytelling and the Sciences of the Mind, is something I heavily recommend for anyone interested in this. Now, his work in storytelling, he defines chunking as a key component in storytelling. Thus, stories, like memories, operate in chunks, in selected narrative fragments, which coalesce and condense. So again, we have this metaphoric quality about stories. Things come together and become metaphors. So sometimes one metaphor can become a story. So metaphors can be seen as sort of micro stories in a certain sense, because there are a lot of semantic investments which go into metaphors. So apart from foregrounding the narrative quality of memory, what this also reveals is how the consolidation and condensation of information that characterize memory and storytelling alike is articulated through absence, things which are excluded and abundant, right? So this is where absence begins to become a big deal, right? Things which are not in the chunk, things which are not remembered. And this is where fiction comes in, interestingly, I think. So I sort of look at fiction as a very handy medium to study memory. So I'm not looking at fiction as sort of stories written by authors, etc. I'm more interested in the ontological quality of fiction, right? This combination of reality and possibility, this combination through which we can articulate presence as well as absence. So that makes fiction a very handy medium, especially if you're trying to map that onto how the mind remembers. Okay. Thus, the storytelling mind is selective, metaphoric, and metonymic, just like the act of remembering. Likewise, consciousness as a connective and emergent activity is mediated through markers which generate structures of kinship, which extend onto culture and cultural identities, which are metaphoric as well as metonymic. So if you look at consciousness as an emergent activity, so there's this emergent quality about consciousness. It sort of starts from somewhere. And of course, connective. For it to become a collective consciousness, it must have a connective quality to it. There's an emergent quality as well as a connective quality about consciousness. But the interesting thing is, and this is the argument I'm making, it is mediated through markers which look for kinship structures. For our consciousness to become a shared consciousness, it must have some kinship structures which extend through a metaphoric and metonymic process. Now, especially in relation to globalization, the connective quality of consciousness operates through a distributive process, which is also hierarchical in quality. And this is the funny bit about globalization. On the one hand, it is distributive. On the other hand, it's also hierarchical, right? Not everything can become globalized. So it must be shared. So there's distributive, nice, democratic, sweet quality of globalization. Everyone's eating burgers everywhere in the world. But then everyone is also not eating other things. So there is also hierarchical quality, a top-down quality about globalization as well. And I'm interested in the simultaneity of this distributive and a hierarchical process in globalization. We sort of celebrate the distributiveness more often than decrying the hierarchical quality. It's the more covert, it's more hidden, it's so smuggled, the hierarchical thing. So this connects to the concept of metaphor and metonymy, whereby an act of spreading is also simultaneously an act of selection. Likewise, for globalization, an act of inclusion also entails acts of exclusion. Acts of remembering generate more micro acts of forgetting. So I'm just going to stop here for a minute and ask, how am I doing in terms of time? How much time do I have?
I think it's time. You need to wind up in a minute or two.
Terrific. Okay. So I'm just going to finish towards the end. So I'll just let go of this presentation. The final thing I'm just going to wind up with is the idea of contagion, right? That's something that I'm interested in as well. Globalization as a contagious process, something which spreads through contagion. And again, the whole idea of contagion, it almost has an infective-like quality. So you're sort of infected by global metaphors. So we begin to consume that, etc. Now, my final argument, of course, is the relevance of fiction. So why look at fiction at all? And I've made the argument about fiction combining different kinds of possibilities. So fiction is...
You have 5 minutes. You can use that.
Okay, great. That's very kind. Okay, so at the end, my argument is fiction has a quantum quality as well as a Quotidian quality. So there's a dailiness about fiction. At the same time, fiction has a sort of quantum quality. It's a very handy medium for consciousness, and we know about sort of streams of consciousness and everything else. But also fiction is also about the dailiness of life. Right? So the dailiness as well as the extraordinariness can sort of come together in fiction. So whether we are conscious or not, fiction is perhaps the single most recursive activity in the rituals informing our everydayness, the constant and asymmetric entanglement of what does happen with what does not, and with what may. It thus accommodates and articulates a complex cognitive frame, that of ambivalence. And I look at ambivalence as an ability to represent both valences, sometimes contradictory ones, sometimes simultaneously. So fiction, in a way, is a textual / readerly, as well as an experiential / writerly activity. Fiction binds memory and storytelling in foregrounding the play of possibilities and realities. In doing so, it emerges as perhaps the most effective and effective marker of consciousness as we experience it privately, as well as in more shared and more fluid forms. Fiction and storytelling may thus be among the earliest markers of a cultural evolution, as well as being among the earliest globalizing activities. Right? So we sort of learn fiction very early on as human beings, storytelling animals. At the same time, globalization can only happen through storytelling. So fiction operates in both ways, in a certain sense. It integrates orders of imagination, emotions, aspirations, and complex chronotopes across different orders of space and time. Thus, my final argument is fiction emerges with renewed relevance in the textual practices and virtual realities in the globalized world we inhabit and internalize today. Thank you very much for your attention.
This was amazing, Avishek. You really presented, an array of ideas, so many, thoughts on memory, how memory functions, how it is linked to medical sciences, neurosciences, and literature, and psychology, and so many other fields. So truly, very rich, talk. And for me personally, I'm really happy that you foregrounded the literariness of literature and the importance of literariness, because most often what is happening in the departments of literature, and something that I feel very strongly about, is that while we are moving towards interdisciplinarity, which is a very welcome step, and culture studies, somewhere, literature is getting sacrificed at the altar of, social sciences and all these, theoretical frameworks that come from other fields. So somewhere our students are not able to strike that balance between, the literature either they slide into pure theme plot kind of study, or they just use literature as an instrument, as a vehicular tool. So I'm really happy that you foregrounded this aspect, and the way you brought in fiction to talk about memory, and how memory itself, instead of fiction being just a representation of memory or just a tool, how memory itself manifests the storytelling process. So that to me was really very important, and I'm glad that you pointed these things out. And there are many questions, so I will pass it on to the rapporteurs to read out questions from the chat box.
Sure, thank you so much.
Who is the rapporteur here today?
Yes, ma'am.
Please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the wonderful talk. We have a lot of questions. Let me read the first one. It says, memory is an act of encoding and effacement. How is it related to globalization? Please clarify it.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I want to talk about in my paper more centrally. Perhaps it didn't come through very well. So I look at globalization as a very metonymic activity, in the sense that the very fundamental difference I made at the beginning of the paper is that globalization is not universalization, right? So globalization is certain privileged forms of representation. For something to become globalized, there must be a privileged investment into it. So in other words, if you look at globalization as an act of encoding, so something gets encoded again and again. So how does a local food become a global food in a certain sense, right? So that obviously has a very complex encoding process, which has economic investments, which are political investments, ideological investments, all kinds of investments. So it is a very strong encoding process that makes something globalized as a consumable idea, food, dress, whatever the case may be. But equally, every act of encoding is also an act of effacement. So certain other forms of representation must be silenced in that particular domain, or must be made marginalized in that particular domain for that to become globalized, for a certain quality, certain entity to become globalized. So my central argument is, just like memory, at a very fundamental cognitive / cultural level, it operates through a simultaneous process of effacement and encoding. But the same structural thing can be seen as replicated in globalization, in a sense that when something gets encoded into becoming a globalized thing, there are other things which must be effaced as well for that encoding to happen. So I think at a theoretical, structural, as well as functional level, there is some convergence to be made between globalization and a process of remembering as we study it through neuroscience as well as some cultural studies.
Thank you so much. There is a question by Shatrupa Mishra. She says, thank you for an insightful deliberation. I'm interested in how active remembering affects the creation of digital archives related to events like the Holocaust and the partition, which become causes célèbres when the conflicts between official memory and family individual memory are emphatic.
Yes, it's a very good question. Thank you. So again, we are looking at the extension of memory into some kind of a material form, and the whole idea of digitizing memory or museumizing memory becomes an act of sort of extension. So this is what I meant at the beginning when I looked at memory as an embedded activity, something which happens in our brain, but also as an inactive activity, something which is so shared in a collective space, right? So of course, the two examples given, the Holocaust and partition, are sort of two key events, in any study of memory, and they become, in a certain sense, big markers of how memory and forgetting operate. So I think digitization is a natural extension of the extended quality of memory, this connective quality of memory. Because if you remember, towards the end of the paper, I looked at consciousness as an emergent phenomenon, as well as a connective phenomenon. So for some kind of consciousness to become a shared hegemonic consciousness, there must be a connective quality to it. And the thing about digitization is that it makes the whole connective quality very flexible in quality. Anyone can get in a digital space from anywhere in the world, right? So there's a sense of plasticity about digitization, which I think is a very useful way to remember the plasticity of memories. That's something which can get inserted, taken out, accessed. So what it also does is it makes the whole modality of memory more distributive in quality, more inactive in quality. So there's no physical building one has to walk into in order to access that memory, right? There's a more distributed plastic quality through a digital space, a digital archive, and all you have to do is sort of get in from no matter where you are in the world. And that makes the politics of access more open. So my argument, and I'm strongly welcome this digitization of memory, because I think this offers acts of remembering a more plastic quality, which can be more democratic and more distributive in quality as well. But just one little caveat, if I may, and this is something I do as a student of memory studies. We also need to take a look at the Quotidian quality of memory, because it is sometimes a little attractive to get swept away by the big political events of memory, like partition, like Holocaust. And the moment we say that we do memory studies, there's an automatic expectation that there's partition somewhere, there's Holocaust somewhere, and there's a lot of work done on that. But I think the way memory studies can be really interesting is that how we can integrate those big events at a political collective level with a more micro events of how we remember at a daily level. And just yesterday, I was giving a talk in our institute about the poetry of Louis Gluck, the recent Nobel laureate. And I think that kind of poetry about memory is something very, very interesting. It attracts me, again, as a student of literature, the sort of rejection of the big public space and the welcoming of the more intimate spaces of remembering, right? True literature, the intimacy of memory, the micro quality of memory. That is something I think is more challenging. The memory which is not available or not accessible or not consumable at a public sphere, right? But a memory which is sort of almost corporealized at an intimate, interpersonal, intersubjective level. So how do you tap into that? How do you study that? Is, I think, the more challenging direction for memory studies. But thank you for an excellent question.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. Is globalization always an act of conscious privileging, or is it also a simultaneous act of voluntary participation into what is globally available culture? Also, how is it related to memory?
Globally, what in culture?
Just a minute. Is globalization always an act of conscious privileging, or is it also a simultaneous act of voluntary participation into what is globally available culture?
Available. Okay, right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's a simultaneous thing. I mean, there's always an investment quality about globalization. For something to become globalized, there has to be some kind of investment deliberately, but also there is a consumable quality about globalization as well. So the question of agency is really complicated when it comes to globalization. So one can be a willing consumer for something to become globalized, right? So the reason why, certain film industries are more dominant than certain other film industries is not just because there's a lot of money pumped into it. That's obviously one reason. A lot of economic investment, propaganda, politics pumped into it, but also it somehow taps into the contagious system of consumption, right? So it's a very complex entanglement of production and consumption. And a question of agency becomes very, very problematic when it comes to globalization. You're quite right in saying that there is a willing consumption as well, that, for something to become globalized, we can't force something to become globalized. That won't work. That'll become propaganda. That's a different domain altogether. Then there's coercion. So if there is a coercive quality about globalization, it must be very, very covert in a certain sense, right? And there is a more spectacular consumable quality. So the coercive quality is more covert, and the consumable quality is more overt about globalization. Otherwise, it will not work, I think, as a globalist phenomenon, right? So, and of course, memory is something that I am interested in at a collective level. And I think towards the end of the paper, I may not have time to spell it out really. I was looking at the contagious quality about memory. So that's another thing that is very interesting for us students of memories, is contagion. How does something spread, especially through affect? The stickiness of affect, as Sarah Ahmed would put it, as something which sticks and spreads together. Right? It could be a knowledge system, it could be a certain kind of masculinity, certain kind of femininity, but something which has to stick as well as spread. Right? So again, we are looking at this simultaneity of distributive and hierarchical quality about globalization. So in terms of how something becomes globalized, there must be a collective remembering process, which at its best, works through affect. So it's not just enough that it's effective in quality, it must also be affective in quality. So that's where the key lies, I think.
Thank you so much. We'll take some more questions as we wait for the next speaker. How do you reconcile the non-linguistic nature of experience in memory and the linguistic mediation of memory of experience, such as being a prisoner in Auschwitz?
Yeah, I mean, there is a very interesting concept, and thank you for that question. And this, of course, connects very well to the idea of traumatic memory, which is sort of defined ontologically as non-linguistic. And the person who is really interesting in this is a contemporary of Freud, someone called Pierre Janet. I'm sure most of you are aware of his work. But Janet's idea, I mean, he was the one who used traumatic memory in a way we use it today. So his idea, if I understand the question correctly, is exactly this, that for traumatic memory to become narrative memory, there must be a temporal gap. So there's a traumatic memory which is essentially and ontologically non-narrative in quality. It cannot be put into a narrative. So there's a rejection about speaking about the suffering. There's a refusal to put that in a narrative. And we have literary examples of that as well. Right, so sort of a tragic comic example would be Art Spiegelman's Mouse, right? Where Artie Spiegelman, who's the protagonist, he wants to write a comic novel about the Holocaust, right? The narrative about the Holocaust. And he goes to his father, who was actually a prisoner in the Holocaust. And the father becomes a reluctant narrator. He doesn't want to convert the trauma into a narration, right? So again, the whole idea of non-narrative quality of memory and the narrative quality of memory, how they become almost different categories of a memory in a certain sense. So my response would be, I wouldn't consider these two as fluid categories. I think they're different categories. So traumatic memory and narrative memory are different categories. And there's a very strong non-linguistic, non-representational quality of memory as well, which should not be seen as an easy extension or as an easy prequel to narrative memory. So I think that needs to be treated very differently and not as connected things.
Sakshi Dogra wants to know, could you elaborate on the intertwinement between affect and memory? I'm thinking in terms of how affect is often thought of as in terms of its essentially mobilizing quality, whereas you speak of memory in metaphoric and metonymic. Are we looking at two different modalities? How do they come together?
No, I mean, metaphor is kinetic. For something to become metaphor, it must have a kinetic quality. It must bring things together. And of course, if it's a good metaphor, it must move us at a very experiential level. So we are moved by metaphors. So there's a kinetic quality about metaphors in the sense that things are brought together, things sort of journey together. There's also an experiential kinesis about metaphors. So when you see a good metaphor, when you experience a good metaphor, we are moved by it to a certain extent. So I think this kinetic quality about metaphor and metonymy is connected to memory, because memory is a process of movement. And also, I mean, this I should perhaps highlight the fact that memory, in a way we look at it today, in neuroscience as well as phenomenology, it has a bi-directional quality. It's not just looking back to the past. It's also a slightly aspirational quality of memory. It's also looking forward to a certain extent. It's looking back as well as looking forward. So I think this kinesis of remembering is something which is very interestingly captured in metaphors and metonymy, which is essentially a way of making language moving, movable, mutable. So both figures of speech are actually, making language into a moving medium, a mutable medium of representation. So in that, they become a very interesting instrument, a very interesting affective instrument, shall we say, of memory.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for the engaging talk and all those answers. Thank you. You explained it beautifully. Thank you. Now, I'll hand it over to Nishat ma'am to continue the plenary session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sadaf. Our next speaker is Dr. Rahul K. Gairola. Welcome, Dr. Rahul Gairola. You joined a bit late, so we had this wonderful talk by Avishek Parui just before you joined. So let me introduce Dr. Rahul Gairola. He is a PhD from University of Washington. He's currently teaching at Krishna, as Krishna Sommer's lecturer in English and Postcolonial Literature, and a fellow of the Asia Research Center at Murdoch University in Greater Perth, Western Australia. He has co-edited and authored a large number of books. He has also been a co-editor of special issues of several prestigious journals. And he's a lifetime member of Pembroke College, University of Cambridge, UK, etc. And he has held various grants and fellowships from various prestigious universities. So a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Rahul Gairola. You have roughly 20 to 25 minutes for your talk. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes, perfect. Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry.
Rahul,
Please
Rahul,
excuse.
before you start, I'm so sorry for intervening. Our next session starts at 12:30. And so we also want to have some time for questions. So maybe if you can speak for 15-20 minutes and then we can take up some questions, right?
No problem. So greetings from Perth, Western Australia. I'm very sorry about the delay. There was some sort of issue with Zoom, as happens with technology. So please excuse that. I'll go through my talk pretty fast. So I did circulate a PPT, but I will just talk us through it instead of putting it up and dealing with the technology. So the title of this talk is called The Future of Social Justice and Digital Humanities. I'd like to just refer to a couple of the points that were brought up in Professor Arjun Appadurai's brilliant talk from the other day. He talked about such two main things that he brought up. He talked about the context of the Anthropocene, which is the age of man and the kinds of challenges that we're having as a global community with respect to climate change and other sorts of natural disaster, number one. And number two, he also talked about the pervasiveness of drone technology and other sort of forms of surveillance. So these two threads are two of the threads that I'd like us to keep thinking about in the context of the conference as I give my talk. So the goal of this talk is to think about the work that I've been doing with Professor Rupika Rism of Salem State University in the United States in the intersection, the coming together of social justice and the digital humanities. We began doing this work in the summer of 2014 at the Women's Technology Conference at the University of Maryland, College Park in the United States. And at that moment, we unequivocally resolved also with Professor Radhika Gajala, who's at Bowling State University in the US. We resolved to think about the ways that digital media and humanities pedagogy can be a means for unlocking invisible biases and trends in both literary and cultural studies, while at the same time committing to humanistic technological innovation, coupled with ethics about how we should generally treat other human beings. And again, this invokes some of the concerns that we heard in Professor Appadurai's talk yesterday. Now, some of the, we can think about this in one major question, and this is a question we can continue to ask and talk about during the dialogue session in 20 minutes. So that question is the following: what should we expect when we think about digital tools or digital technology? And the, if we want to put it this way, the digital milieu, the period we're living in that is marked by digital culture and technology, or even if we want to think about this kind of pervasivity of digital tools in what Professor Appadurai called the Anthropocene, the age of man. And how do we want to think about these things in seeking out an ethical existence in cyberspace? So how is an ethical existence different in cyberspace versus, say, in the material world that we inhabit? So the work of the recent work of Rupika Rism is really important. She recently published a book which you may or may not have heard of. It's called New Digital Worlds: Postcolonial Digital Humanities in Theory, Praxis, and Pedagogy. And this is a very important work because it gives us a way to think about the interface of, on the one hand, digital media culture and technology, digital tools, digital pedagogy, this very novel interface that we're using now to communicate with between India and Australia, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the period that we call post-colonial, and not just the historical period of the post-colonial, but also the ideological and theoretical ways in which we think about post-coloniality and the continuing ways in which there's a certain afterlife of empire in different sectors of human existence around the world. So RISM's work is important, I think, because it starts with a very important moment that unfolded in the United States. And this is historically significant in the context of the January 20th US election, the shift from Trumpism to Biden and Harris. Harris, who is the first woman to be a vice president in the US, and also she's half Desi. So this is a big moment historically for us. But for RISM, the historical moment that catalyzes the need for what she calls post-colonial digital humanities is the disaster in Puerto Rico and the formation of what was called the Puerto Rico Mapathon for hurricane relief that came up in the face of natural disaster that unfolded. So one quote that I'd like to share with you that RISM shares is she says in defining post-colonial DH, the following: post-colonial digital humanities is an approach to uncovering and intervening in the disruptions within the digital cultural record produced by colonialism and neocolonialism. While Hurricane Maria exposed the cruelties of neocolonialism in Puerto Rico, highlighting the United States government's tepid response and indifference to the territory's debt crisis, the Mapathon organizers recognized the contributions they could make to disaster relief by improving maps of Puerto Rico that populate the digital cultural record. She goes on to say, through their participation and intervention in post-colonial digital humanities, that is, these mappers helped upgrade one of the digital representations of Puerto Rico, remaking a digital world while actually saving material lives. So this is, important to think about in terms of the ways that maps operate. When we think about a country as large and diverse as India, for example, August of 1947, and the task of partition, for example, the use of paper maps and the kind of power relations and colonial vested interests that were involved in something like partition. It's a very different look when we think about Google Earth and online mapping technologies, which are also imbricated in the kinds of surveillance technologies that Professor Parui spoke about. But to go back to the Puerto Rico Mapathon, for RISM in her theorization of what she calls post-colonial digital humanities, the Puerto Rico Mapathon demonstrates the digital cultural record has consequences for people's lives. So to put that another way, the digital is not just about surveillance and oppression, as we might think when we think about drone technology or other biometric kind of modes of disciplinary technology, but it also has material impact on people's lives. And RISM goes on to say that for events like the Mapathon, intervening in the digital cultural record is an acute matter of life or death in the Anthropocene, that is to say, the age of man, where the stakes of race and colonialism play out in the medium of environmental disaster on the bodies of Puerto Ricans, that is to say, people of color, right? People that don't benefit from the kinds of ways in which power relations are even to this day shaped by white supremacy, sexism, gender preferences, homophobia, and so on and so forth. She goes on to notice that United States citizens cut across from access to food, water, shelter, and healthcare was the reality for these Puerto Ricans during the disaster, the natural disaster. And yet, the digital cultural record, in its gaps, omissions, and rehearsal of colonial dynamics from the analog cultural records, also had a chronic problem of perpetrating epistemic violence. Thus, post-colonial digital humanities is not only a theoretical or analytical approach to the digital cultural record, she notes that rather it requires praxis at the intersection of digital technologies and humanistic inquiry, designing new workflows and building new archives, tools, databases, and other digital objects that actively resist reinscriptions of colonialism and neocolonialism. Thus, Postcolonial Digital Humanities explores how we might remake the worlds that are instantiated in the digital cultural record through politically, ethically, and social justice initiatives. And these approaches we can actually deploy to digital knowledge production. So this is a framing that does resonate. The first is the historical context of the disaster of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. The second move we can think of as asking how or why this natural material disaster, which we can see as a product that is produced in the Anthropocene, in lots of the the kinds of human concerns that we have today with global warming and so on, man-made disasters, and how this intersects with the digital milieu. And then the third move there is to then link this to something that many of us are very familiar with, which is postcolonial studies, postcolonial theory. So in that vein, Rizm continues, and she notes the following, that as they undertake this work, digital humanities practitioners, they do so in the context of a politics of knowledge that has not been hospitable to those outside the dominant cultures of the global North. We live in, whether, I don't know if it's just global North and global South, because even as a person of Indian descent, whose body is marked as brown and not white, it's something that I experience almost every day in Australia, even when on the street, casually, an Australian person might say to me like, oh my goodness, you speak such great English. So there are lots of assumptions made, not just of Indians, South Asians, people living in South Asia, but also Desi diasporas outside of South Asia. But, for Rizm and this idea of why a postcolonial digital humanities is important, she goes on to note that thus the critiques of the cultural record articulated by well-known postcolonial scholars, including Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, and Ajiz Ahmad, have not gone away as the digital cultural record has been developed. Rather, and instead, the hallmarks of colonialism in the cultural record that we're used to, in film, media, literature, for example, it demonstrates issues, fissures, and lacunas in politics of representation that render subjects of the global South under the gaze of the global North, and complicity in the act of world making, how we understand the world and what it means in different contexts. These are being ported over into the digital cultural record, unthinkingly, perhaps, without malice even, in part because post-colonial critique has not made many inroads into the practices of digital humanities. Now, there are some initiatives that have been coming up with thinking about how to mediate against the ways in which biases, however unintentional they are, from the cultural record that we're used to, migrate over into the digital cultural record. And these interventions in the frame of what Rizm has called postcolonial digital humanities, they surface through things like hashtag transform-DH, which is a hashtag that aggregates all topics that are tagged as such through this particular semantics on online sites. And the group Global Outlook Digital Humanities, which I'm on the executive board of nowadays. And these two digital mechanisms examine the political dimensions of digital knowledge production from the margins. So this is these are important initiatives in thinking about how postcolonial digital humanities is significant to as a framework, is significant to the actual digital tools that we use when we're in the digital atmosphere. Now, Rizm has also argued against the language of disrupting the digital humanities. And this is important because there are different camps within digital humanities. And it's important to note these distinctions because it's not just one homogeneous field. And in fact, the very definition of the digital humanities is something that's still up in the air. There are many different, differing perceptions of what this might mean. So let me foreground Rism's argument against this metaphor of disrupting the digital humanities. She goes on to point out that while post-colonial digital humanities tackles the colonial and neo-colonial echoes in the digital cultural record, it does not position itself against digital humanities, nor is it part of moves to disrupt digital humanities that is advocated in the volume published by Dr. Dorothy Kim and Dr. Jesse Stommel, two scholars that are also working in the United States. The rhetoric, she goes on to say, of disruption in this context proposes to reappropriate the term from its connection to technological innovation and to rehabilitate its critical potential. So at first glance then, disruption conjures up a blow struck against hegemony, that is to say domination without force, domination through coercion, Gramsci's term for domination through coercion. And what she goes on to say, a feeling of out with the old and in with the new, and hope for transformation. However, the very qualities that give disruption currency as an intellectual category have made it a buzzword for contemporary globalization, attracting the fond gaze of global capitalism and neo-capitalism. So to put this in simple terms, the language of disruption has been coerced or has been absorbed by the very mechanisms that work against peoples of color or the so-called global South, namely in what we popularly know as neoliberal capitalism, for example. And neoliberal capitalism is inextricably bound up and mired in neocolonialism and other forms of exploitation that continue to target and victimize countries, nations, territories on Earth where people can be continue to be distinguished by the color of their skin. Rism goes on to say that the digital cultural record, moreover, is already rent by disruptions born from capitalism, colonialism, and indeed racism, also sexism, homophobia, lingualism, nationalism, religion. I mean, we could go on and on. From the Latin word disrumpere, which means to break into pieces or bust asunder, a disruption is an interruption. A disruption is an interruption. And I'll here quote Rism, quote, "The action of rendering or bursting asunder, violent dissolution of continuity, forcible severance," unquote. That's what makes a disruption an interruption. The lives of colonial subjects and people of the African diaspora have historically been viewed as disruptive to dominant cultures that preserve a white status quo, as have their languages, histories, and cultural heritages. Now, in terms of Dorothy Kim and Jesse Stammel's volume, which does use this notion of disruption, they have a piece in it which I think is very important, and that piece, which was published in 2018, is titled "How to Decolonize DH," and decolonize DH is actually a hashtag. So anyone that's interested in further following this kind of theme or anything that I'm talking about in this topic, you can go into Google, put in hashtag, or excuse me, sometimes it's called pound. So either hashtag sign or pound sign, decolonize DH, and you can follow those threads and to your heart's desire and see what kinds of things already exist in the digital milieu. But I'd like to quote something that they say in their article titled "How to Decolonize DH, Actionable Steps for an Anti-Fascist DH." And Kim writes, "A number of groups have written manifestos to the digital humanities, especially in relation to DH's issues with openness, race, disability, LGBTQ, feminist, and other kinds of non-normative bodies in the field. There have been critical discussions in hashtag transform DH, Hashtag, which is another digital humanities organization based at the City University of New York in the United States. Another group called FemTechNet, and other groups that have been writing such manifestos and working to shift and change the digital humanities with respect to being more equitable, more conscious of the intersectionality of race, class, gender, and sexuality in the context of colonial histories and post-colonial ideologies and ways of thinking in the 21st century. Now, what I want to do then, as I wrap up this talk and as we open up the discussion and perhaps link it back to Dr. Puri's talk, which was preceded mine, and also some of the other threads that have been running through the conference, and of course, Professor Appadurai's keynote that inaugurated the conference, is to think about practical steps to decolonizing digital humanities, or maybe even just opening up a conversation today with everyone online and asking, well, what exactly is digital humanities? Is it something that's necessarily already, always already placed in the West, or something that's always already mired in neoliberal formations of privilege or capitalism or power that presuppose or perhaps have already installed within it certain threads or variations of casteism or racism, sexism, homophobia, privilege, these ideas of the North-South binary, which is something else we might want to even, we might even want to talk about that. This idea of a global North and a global South, does that still fit? Is it still accurate, for example? Because these are important questions, I think, that we can begin to start with if we want to use the time we have for this dialogue to even say, well, what exactly is digital humanities? How does it intersect with notions of phenomenology, subjectivity, globalization? As the conference theme is looking at the intersections between the local and the global, or the glocal, how does this all come together or get complicated? Number one, by digital tools, digital technology, and number two, how does it get further complicated by the histories or the power relations that are punctuated and perpetuated by colonialist projects that have shaped all of us, not just in India, not just in South Asia, but even me as a subject that's sitting in a very privileged position here in Australia as an American citizen, someone with a US passport. So I think what I'll do, there's a lot more here, but I think rather than going on and on, I think it'd be more interesting, at least for me, to open up a dialogue, answer any questions you have. I think we have a little bit of extra time for some robust speaking, some robust talking about this. And so I'll just end right there by saying, how does all this have to do with my work? Or, how does this come together with what I have to, what I'm doing right now? And I really thought it was nice that Professor Appadurai in his talk, he reminded us that this is semi-new work, but he reminded us that he'd written the talk that he delivered just for this conference. And I can't say that what you've heard was written specifically for the conference today, although the specific context of thinking about globalization, thinking about phenomenology, thinking about agency, subjectivity, and what that means to be in the so-called global South, where the historical manacles of colonialism and to be subjects that are marked bodily by race or gender, to have different skin colors, as we all know with these skin creams in India. In my research, my current research, all of this gets imbricated in the ways in which we think about home. Therefore, the idea of home, which has been central, not just to post-colonial studies and diaspora studies, but also in thinking about the digital world. What does it mean when we talk about a home page, for example? The ideas of home have been translated over into the digital milieu and into cyberspace, the ways we talk about being at home, but even when we're not physically and materially present somewhere, we talk about being there. And I think that kind of, my current interest and the current book that I'm working on right now, it's called Digital Homes, Technology and Sexuality in the Indian Diaspora. So I'm very interested in looking at how technology and sexuality and gender come together and complicate notions of home in the digital world. And I believe that the project, this book that I'm currently working on, these kinds of questions and methodologies and queries that I'm looking at that have been sparked by Rupika Rism's work on post-colonial digitality, I think that this is very significant when we talk about the questions and notions of globalization, the global local binary. And I mean, I think it's a binary that we might even want to break down. And finally, the notion of phenomenology that all anchor the conference that we're in today. So thank you everyone for listening. And I want to thank the conference organizers so much the kind invitation and for the very stimulating program you put together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gairola. You spoke of intersectionality of DH with post-colonial studies, decolonial studies, and our current context. And you talked of, Rupika Risam's book at length. Well, Rupika was here in our DH conference, last month, and she also spoke of her work. So maybe in the conversations that we'll have now, we might get to hear more about your work, which you just mentioned. You're working on concept of home and digital diasporas. So let's see, I mean, whether these questions can tease you to talk about your work. So over to the to the rapporteur for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Gairola, for that very exciting lecture. I have, for now, I have this one question in the chat box. It is from Shotarupa Mishra. She's writing, "Thank you, sir, for an informative talk. I was wondering how a certain text like African proverbs as epistemologies of decolonization would be categorized while creating a post-colonial digital archive. Would it be confined to the indigenous label?"
That's a great question. I think it would have to depend on how we're defining indigenous, number one, and also how we would, what languages we're talking about and how language, even nationality, enter the mix and how we might want to deal with those. But I think in terms of creating a post-colonial digital archive, I think the sky's the limit. The other question, and the reason I say that is the other question is, there are, and if you all had Rupika here earlier, then you probably heard some of this before, but as she points out, there are a politics and a certain, power relations that even translate into the very act of digitizing something, digitization, in other words, to put this another way, digitization in the act of is also a political act. It's a representation of what is canonical, what can be funded to be digitized, and even the ideological notion of what should be knowledge that's preserved and archived and digitized. Because when we think about something that's digitized, we're thinking about it as being archived, not just archived, curated and archived and placed into cyberspace or into some other digital structure where it would be eternal and accessible here on. So I think these kinds of questions of post-coloniality and the ways in which certain biases come up would is one of many other factors in us considering the possible answers to your very provocative question. It's not just provocative, it's a very important question. I'd like to point out that the way that I would answer this question would also be very different than some of my colleagues that would say, well, very well say, well, no, it's not part of the canon. It's not classical literature. It's not British or Western literature, right? I mean, this is something that, that I experience quite often as someone who was previously for 2.5 years, I was in Northern India at IIT Roorkee, a very different way of thinking about literature and the way that we thought about English versus here. We're here in Australia, the British flag is in the top left-hand corner of the Aussie flag. So there's a very intentional, even nationalistic alignment to the British Empire here in Australia. And I find that carries over also in the ways that even scholars and academics talk about the kinds of texts and culture that is worthy of being archived, worthy of being digitized, worthy of being preserved. And it's very often not the kinds of texts that you and me would think is important. I often have to find myself having to explain to people who's Raja Rao, who's R.K. Narayan, right? They're people who, not saying that it's necessarily that they're biased, but the fact that many people here wouldn't know who those novelists are, well, that speaks for itself in its own way. So to go back to the question that was posed, I think it seems to me that in answering this question, we have to think about not just definitions, interpretations, and the ways in which we're thinking about the different terms offered in this question, but also what indigenous means and who is getting represented when we talk about Indigenous? Why is that important? What are the socio-political stakes involved? You know, Spivak has given us this lovely question since 1988. Can the subaltern speak? You know, and I think that this question becomes really important even when we talk about the digital milieu and cyberspace. And this is the reason why something, you know, something like, you know, Rizm's work on postcolonial DH is so important. Or even if we go back to Radhika's work on cyber culture and the subaltern from, you know, about a decade ago, it's important work because we have to think about the replications and reinvocations of otherness, even in cyberspace, at the same time that the captains of industry are heralding, especially right now in this moment with COVID, especially in higher education, when those that are above us say, well, you know, online learning, it's the best way to go, right? I mean, the motives might be different, you know, when we talk about profit making in online learning and getting as many people enrolled. It might not be the same as for students or scholars that are on the ground. So I thank you very much, Shatarupa, for your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gairola. I have another question from my co-host, and she's writing, how do digital humanities scholars deal with the aesthetics of a text? Does some of it get lost in the digitization?
That is something that we debate and talk about all the time. And you know, I don't know who your co-host is, but thank you to the co-host for asking this important question. This is something that I actually have a unit, I have a weekly lecture that I deliver on this very question. And you know, for that lecture, you know, the reading that we start with is Walter Benjamin's very important essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. You all, or some of you might know, he's a very important Marxist theorist, but I think he kicks us off in thinking about these kinds of questions when he talks about and defines the so-called aura of a work of art. And these kinds of questions have been around even before the 1930s when this essay came out. I think that I think on the most material level, digitality and digitization, it does take away something. It takes away the materiality of a text. And to give you a very important example, my students, for example, many of my students, when I teach my classes, I'll say, okay, well, I put all the readings are online. I've distributed them as PDFs. It's all there. You all can save money. You don't have to go to the bookstore and pay, you know, $80 for the reader. I thought I had one right. Oh, I do have one. Yeah. So you don't have to go and pay, this because of the copyright, this would cost, $60, $70. But, invariably students every semester, they say, well, no, we would actually like the hard copy. Now, why is that? Because this is part of the answer to the question. People want to hold something in their hands. There's something about the materiality of holding a book or a text, about being able to mark it. It's not just about absorbing the marks that are on the page already. It's about you as a scholar, a reader, a thinker, having a pen or even, a highlighter and being able to make your mark, no pun intended, but there it is, to make your mark upon the text. And I think that we don't get that same interaction when we're dealing with digital text. And I mean, Adobe Acrobat and other softwares have been, platforms for digital textuality have been doing a good job at adding tools and all to do this. But if you're asking me personally, I find that there's nothing as satisfying on a cold night with, on a cold night. I know it's winter there in India and it's summer over here, but on a cold night, all you need is a cup of tea, a good book, and a pen that works. And there's a certain satisfaction, and there's a certain intellectual, we could even say spiritual, there's a certain psychic interaction between the text and me when I have a pen or a highlighter and I'm interacting with it in a way that I can't do with the digital interface. So that would be one way of answering that question. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Gairola. With this, we come to the end of our plenary session. I would thank both the speakers, Dr. Parui and Dr. Gairola, for joining us, and of course, Nishat ma'am for acting as the chair. Over to you, Zahra.
Well, let me wrap it up. Thank you. Thank you to both the speakers. Thank you to Avishek for his amazing talk. And thanks to Dr. Gairola for joining just in time when we were losing hope. So thanks to both the speakers. And now over to Zahra.
Thank you, everyone. We have a couple of minutes before we start with our next session. So please be online. You can mute yourself for these few minutes and we'll be there. See you all in a couple of minutes.